It isn't known for sure what year the Flemish artist Pieter Bruegel was born, but the best estimates are between 1525 and 1530. Similarly, the precise location of his birth isn't certain, although it was most likely in or around the town of Breda, some 30 miles north of Antwerp. The spelling of Bruegel's name is something of a movable feast too. In his early life it was spelled with an H after the G, but from 1559 onwards he dispensed with it, even though the rest of his family stuck with its inclusion. It's recorded that he entered the Antwerp Painters Guild in 1551, where his master was the painter Pieter van Aalst. There are only 2 pieces of work by Bruegel from this time still in existence, both of which are landscapes drawn with pen and ink and dated 1552. After his training he travelled to Italy to see the works of the Renaissance firsthand, and it was in Rome in 1553 that Bruegel produced his earliest signed and dated painting, Landscape with Christ and the Apostles at the Sea of Tiberias. On his return in 1555 he settled in Antwerp and set about the production of drawings which were transcribed as engravings by Pieter van der Heyden and sold by the publisher and printer Hieronymus Wellens de Kock. As yet, the influence of Hieronymus Bosch, who had died a decade or so before Bruegel's birth, had yet to make an appearance in his painting, but it was very evident in his drawings for print. So much so that this print, entitled The Big Fish Eat the Little Fish, was actually sold by the unscrupulous Mr. de Kock as being an original by Bosch in order to sell more copies. Whether Bruegel was a party to this fakery isn't recorded. The Parable of the Sower was painted in 1557, and although it was a biblical reference, Bruegel set the spectacular scene in his own place and time, a device commonly used across Europe by many artists. It was also in that year that he painted A Pig Must Go in a Sty, a small circular comedic image which visually translates what was then a well-known saying. And although a modest enough piece of work, it was actually significant as the first of his paintings to exclusively depict the humble Flemish peasants of his time. But demand for his work as prints continued, and along with this particularly rare original pen and ink drawing titled The Alchemist, we also have copies of the reversed engraved image of it published in 1558. In the same year, the series of engravings The Seven Deadly Sins was published, and it proved to be a significantly popular choice of subject with the prosperous merchant classes who were buying his work. The spectre of Hieronymus Bosch was again present in these images, with terrifying characters and visual metaphors in abundance, each contributing to his frequently darkly humorous condemnation of the various vices. And it says quite a lot about the fire and brimstone times in which he lived that such essentially unpleasant imagery would have been considered desirable for private or public display by his patrons. It was also in 1558 that he completed 12 Proverbs, an unusually formatted painting arranged as a series of circles on a wooden panel, each of which featured a flat red background. Some of these sayings are of course no longer in use, but others, including banging your head against a brick wall, are still in common parlance. This collection led only a year later to a very similar but far more visually satisfying work titled Netherlandish Proverbs. Although the subject matter was the same, in this painting the various activities and characters were collected as one panoramic scene of a typical village, within which the inhabitants act out the proverbs and idiomatic expressions to considerable comic and surreal effect. And unsurprisingly, some of the same expressions shown in the earlier work, including the brick wall illusion, reappeared in this absorbing painting too. The fight between Carnival and Lent also dates from 1559, and it was another complex and heavily populated image. In the foreground, the two opponents, embodiments of indulgence and abstinence, are engaged in a comedic joust. These two symbolic representations are surrounded by those who gravitate towards one side or the other, and it seems the artist himself refrains from taking any particular side or making judgment. And displaying a similarly balanced outlook, in 1560 Bruegel created another series of engravings, this time featuring the 7 virtues as a companion piece to the earlier Sins collection. And I can't help commenting that it seems to me he was considerably more interested in his depictions of the transgressors than he was of the virtuous central figures in each composition. The painting Children's Games from 1560 is another example of Bruegel at his most playful, and as a chronicler of the lives of the ordinary peasants of his time. It compels the viewer to browse the picture from scene to scene, using an elevated viewpoint to show clusters of Flemish children playing games on the street of a typical town. And the painting is another perfect example of what distinguishes Bruegel from others of his time, as it documents the daily lives of peasants, however artificially composed, with no hint of either grandiosity or sentimentality. It's by no means certain, but he may have painted this particularly straightforward image of a sailing ship with no apparent metaphorical subtext around the same time. The fall of the rebel angels, a battle between good and evil described in the book of Revelations, was painted in 1562, and it was the first of Bruegel's paintings to fully mirror the same nightmarish qualities and subject matter to be found in most of Bosch's art. In fact, for several centuries this image was widely considered to be painted by Bosch, until Bruegel's signature was eventually discovered hiding behind the picture frame. And its subject matter gave him the perfect vehicle to create some spectacularly repellent representations of demons and other assorted manifestations of evil. The Triumph of Death, another truly disturbing masterpiece, is also thought to have been created at this time, and it's yet another jaw-dropping example of his ability to draw the viewer in and oblige them to view and ponder every small scenario within the overall composition, however repulsive or violent they may be. Although 1562's The Suicide of Saul looks like it would be an imposingly large panoramic image, it was, like quite a lot of Bruegel's paintings, actually remarkably small at about 13 by 22 inches. In 1563 Bruegel moved from Antwerp to Brussels, and he married Mayken Kerke, the daughter of his former teacher Pieter Kerke van Alst and his wife Mayken Verhulst. It was also in 1563 that he painted Mad Meg, another particularly disturbing fantasy scene which depicts this Flemish folklore character leading an army of women into the depths of hell in a complex and suitably satanically lit fantasy scenario. During his lifetime, Bruegel created 3 paintings of the Tower of Babel, but the first is now lost. The 2 surviving paintings are similar to each other but not identical, and both date from 1563. They are known respectively as the Large and Little Tower, simply based on their respective sizes, and why he would have returned to this subject more than once isn't known. The precise year the painting Cutting Out the Stone of Madness isn't known for sure, but the general consensus seems to be it was around this time. Whenever it was painted, it depicts the procedure known as trepanning as a brutal supposed cure for mental illness. You have to wonder who would willingly have an image as disturbing and unpleasant as this hanging over the mantelpiece. Landscape with the Flight into Egypt was also painted in 1563, and it depicts the Holy Family fleeing Herod's slaughter of children. But as usual, Bruegel made no attempt to paint the scene as if anywhere but his homeland. And the same year's The Adoration of the Magi in the Snow was even more resolutely 16th century and Flemish. 1564's The Procession to Calvary was one of Bruegel's bigger physical works at around 4 by 6 foot. And within this spectacular landscape inhabited by hundreds of small figures is a far from easy to spot Christ carrying his cross, and it's actually the Virgin Mary in the foreground who represents the true focus of the image. But the same year's Adoration of the Kings was a somewhat unexpected departure for Bruegel, and the relative simplicity and closer viewpoint of this painting was more in line with the approach of his contemporaries in southern Europe. Winter Landscape with a Bird Trap was painted in 1565 and at first glance appears to be a rather charming winter landscape. But as the viewer's gaze is led to the bottom right, the wooden trap and its victims suggest a more sinister and unsettling purpose, which, like much of Bruegel's work, alludes to the perilous nature of existence. The Hunters in the Snow was also painted in 1565, and the gloom of the light, the palette of typically earthy colours, and the way the figures and dogs lead us into the distance of the image all conspire to make this a timeless masterpiece. And if there is a sinister underlying message to be found in this image, I'm glad to say it's wasted on me, and I'm happy to take it at face value. It's one of only 5 surviving paintings depicting the months of the year, all of which were around 5 by 3 foot. The other paintings are also all landscapes with figures involved in various rural activities. And like so much of Bruegel's work, these images seem to reach across the centuries, despite the immeasurable transformation in our daily lives since that time. His 1566 painting, The Preaching of John the Baptist, placed the viewer at the back of the gathered crowd, and again used the device of painting the actual subject of the image quite small in the distance. The census at Bethlehem was also painted in 1566, and was another deliberate return to a snowbound northern setting, and typically the figures of Joseph and Mary are of little if any more physical significance than anyone else depicted. The remarkably similar The Massacre of the Innocents from the following year featured another snowbound composition, even though it was an overt reference to Herod's slaughter. If, like me, you were wondering why there isn't a single murdered child to be seen in the painting, they were apparently there originally, but were actually painted over on the orders of Rudolf II, a Holy Roman Emperor some years after Bruegel's death. The same year as the conversion of Paul would be his last religiously themed work, and as with so much of his painting, we have to fight our way through the crowds to discover the actual subject, this tiny figure who has fallen from his horse. Bruegel's painting of the land of cocaine, a mythical paradise where peasants could live a life of excess, was oddly restrained given the potential of the subject. But as if to compensate for this remarkably sedate close-quarter image, the Wine of St. Martin's Day, completed in the following year, was very much just that, and actually seems to look benignly on the peasants getting royally drunk on the first wines of the season. Among several paintings created in 1868 was The Magpie on the Gallows, another image dominated by the vast landscape setting. And again it has symbolic significance as a reflection on the potential and fatal consequences of baseless malicious gossip and false accusation. There followed a run of more close-quarter figure-based works, with the sinister print The Beekeepers, and the brutally unsentimental painting The Beggars, all of whom have limbs missing. Both The Peasant Nest and The Misanthrope are small paintings created at this time, which are moralistic in intent, using metaphors easily understood by Bruegel's contemporaries, but which seem to place symbolism above actual pictorial engagement, unfortunately. But The Blind Leading the Blind, unusually for Bruegel painted on canvas, was a far more visually entertaining, if jaundiced, observation of man's folly, and a perfect visual translation of the passage taken from the New Testament, and still, of course, widely used even now. The Peasant Wedding is another Bruegel painting I could never grow tired of. It's the pure humanity evident in the work, and the irresistible aesthetic appeal of the diagonal composition, which draws the viewer effortlessly from the 2 men serving in the foreground down the rows of guests to the back where the musicians are entertaining the gathering. And arguably, it's Bruegel's obviously affectionate depictions of everyday life among the less well-off of his time and place, something very few others were bothered with, that are his most enduring contribution to the world of art. The thematically similar The Peasant Dance was the last work from this remarkable year of productivity, and manages again without undue sentimentality to depict these ordinary people drinking and dancing to the music prior to sleeping it off and rising at dawn for another day's labour for their masters. Like so much of his work, a timeless and resonant theme. but these would be his last completed pictures, because Pieter Bruegel the Elder died in Brussels from unknown causes in 1569, where he was somewhere between 40 and 45 years old. Following his death, his sons Pieter and Jan were both trained as painters by Mayk and Verhulst, but neither could eclipse or even come close to what their father had achieved. But I want to end with this engraving, The Battle About Money, which wasn't actually published until after his death. And as far as I'm concerned, it's a monochrome satirical masterpiece, which makes a more than fitting conclusion and continues to resonate to this day.